Welcome everyone. My name is Chris Bell. I'm a partner with Moss Adams, and we're thrilled to be invited by CPCA to give this presentation on nonprofit organization lending programs, really focusing on what's frequently referred to as the Main Street Lending Program, and specifically the programs that target nonprofit organizations. Presenting alongside me will be Colleen Ramires, a CPA. Colleen is a tax senior manager with Moss Adams, where she's been for the last 12 years. She's a thought leader in our tax-exempt practice and works on a large number of healthcare organizations, and we're thrilled to have her expertise in this presentation today. We have an agenda covering the major topics for today's presentation. There'll be an overview of the lending program that the Federal Reserve has issued targeting nonprofit organizations. We'll talk about the different program options. We'll talk about who the eligible borrowers will be, as well as the borrower conditions. And while we're discussing what the conditions are, we're going to be discussing some of the common decision points and perspectives that we're seeing our clients have and discuss and go through as they make decisions around this lending program. So for a brief overview of the program, it's frequently referred to as the Main Street Lending Program. Technically, the name is the Nonprofit Organization Lending Program, or NOLP, but don't be confused too much by that title. The CARES Act refers to the Federal Reserve setting up a lending facility or a lending program, and that's frequently referred to as the Main Street Lending Program, but under that there's different subsets. So this is the Nonprofit Organization Lending Program. It's managed by the Federal Reserve. The CARES Act provided up to $600 billion to facilitate this lending. It's in the process of being rolled out, and this is an important area to emphasize because whereas the PPP loans and some of the other SBA loans were very quick to come out into the market, the Federal Reserve is still just in the beginning stages of rolling this out. For the nonprofit organizations, there are two available programs. You can have a program that really focuses on new loans, and there would be a separate program that focuses on expanding existing loans to nonprofit organizations. A confusing area of this program is that the Federal Reserve is not directly lending money to borrowers. So what's happening is you're applying for this program through your bank. The bank is making a loan to your organization, and the Federal Reserve is subsidizing or really guaranteeing the loan, so that the bank is taking on essentially very little risk in issuing these large loans. And it's intended to get liquidity out in the marketplace. If you go back to when the CARES Act was passed in late March of 2020, it was intended to get liquidity to organizations and to help them to be able to retain their workforce, retain their wage and salary levels, and to keep their businesses going and open during this very difficult time. There was an acknowledgement in the CARES Act that many of the programs focus primarily on very small businesses. And so this Main Street Lending Program is intended, while it can be used for some smaller businesses, it's really intended to hit mid-sized and large organizations.
So as Chris mentioned, there's two different options or two different program options under the Nonprofit Organization Lending Program. These are similar to what's offered under the Main Street Lending. There's a priority one that's offered under Main Street that's not offered under this. But the Federal Reserve feels like these two are going to meet most of the needs for not-for-profit organizations. The reason they set up a separate program for nonprofits is a lot of the requirements and financial ratios and whatnot that they put in place under Main Street Lending, they weren't quite, applicable. It wasn't an apple-to-apple comparison when you were looking at for-profit organizations compared to not-for-profits. So when they put this in place, a lot of the program options and what you'll see these details under here are similar to Main Street, not all of them, but similar. But then you'll see when we get into what eligible borrowers are is that there's a lot of differences there when compared to the Main Street Lending. So this table just kind of nicely summarizes what's similar between the two facilities and what's different. The main thing for the new loans, you're looking at loans that are originated after June 15th. For the expanded, you're looking at loans that are originated before June 15th. Also, there has to be a remaining maturity of at least a year and a half. And so essentially, once we can expand loans, expand the terms of loans that are already in place, and one is we can provide new loans to organizations. The loan term for both is 5 years. The minimum is different between the two. For new, it's $250,000. For expanded, it's $10 million. And then also the maximum size can vary. The maximum is the lesser of $35 million or $300 million, depending on what facility you're using. But it could be even lower than that if the borrower's average quarterly revenue in 2018 is under those higher thresholds. A risk retention of 5%, that just means that the lender, only 95% is being covered by the Federal Reserve, so the lender's on the hook for 5%, not really going to impact the borrower. Principal repayment, there's a deferral of that in year 1 and 2, and then in year 3 through 5, 15% are due, and then in the final year, 70% are due. So there's kind of almost like a balloon payment at the end of the loan period. Interest payments are deferred for 1 year, so it's a little bit different than the principal payment. The interest rate is LIBOR plus 3%, so it is lower interest rates than you may be able to get on some other lending. And then you can do prepayment without penalty.
Thank you, Colleen. When it comes to eligible borrowers, a nonprofit organization that would qualify for this program would have to qualify for a federal exemption under IRC 501c3 or 501c19. You would need to be an organization with 15,000 or fewer employees, or who have $5 billion or less in 2019 revenue. You would need to have continuous operations since January 1st, 2015. So you can see in this, they're really targeting organizations that have been around for a while and aren't brand new. And you have to have at least 10 employees. You also have a requirement that the endowment in the nonprofit be less than $3 billion.
And Chris, if I can just kind of add some more information to this. So with the 501c19 is Veterans Organization. They're also in the FAQ that the Federal Reserve put out stated that public hospitals and universities may qualify if they can show that they would qualify for exemption under 501c3. A lot of times public hospitals will have 501c3 for benefit plans maybe that they have. So if they have that, then there's a good possibility that they could qualify. When considering the number of employees and the revenue, you need to consider any affiliates within that. Also, the Federal Reserve has said you can either look at your GAAP revenue per your audited financial statements, or you can choose to use your revenue per your tax returns. And then the endowment being less than $3 billion, I would say that's probably has come out of, when the Paycheck Protection Program came out and there were a lot of organizations that applied, and it seemed like, hey, you have all these reserves that you could utilize to kind of keep going, and you're taking this money away from other smaller organizations that may really need it, and there was a public kind of backlash from that. And that's probably part of the reason why they put this into place, is that so organizations that have very large endowments are having to rely on some of those endowments versus going out and getting preferred lending.
And that's a very interesting situation, both in the PPP program that you referenced as well as this endowment situation, because in many cases, organizations may have funds, but those funds are committed in very specific ways. They can only be used for very specific purposes. So that it'll be interesting to see how that is evaluated as the Federal Reserve looks at those. In addition, for eligible borrowers, their non-donation revenue must be at least 60% of expenses for the period 2017 through 2019. We're going to go through a number of these metrics as we go through this. So the 2019 EBITDA the ratio of that to unrestricted operating revenue needs to be at least 2%. The liquid assets to average daily expenses over the previous year needs to be a ratio of at least 60 days. And finally, at the time of the loan origination, unrestricted cash and investments to existing outstanding and undrawn available debt, and that's important there. It's not just your outstanding debt, it's also undrawn available debt, like a line of credit that you have but haven't fully drawn on, including NOLP funding, plus any CMS accelerated in advance payments that you may have received, is greater than 55%. Any comments there, Colleen?
Yeah, I would say this last criteria may cause an issue for a lot of organizations to become eligible borrowers. As you mentioned, undrawn available debt, you have to include the NOLP funding. You also have to include any line of credit, even if you're not fully utilizing that. You also can only look at unrestricted cash and investments. So going back to the endowment comment, if you have endowments and you have donor-restricted investments in there, you're not able to include any of those investments in this ratio calculation. Also just wanted to specify on the non-donation revenue, it seems pretty straightforward. There are some exceptions. So government grants do not get excluded. So they're included in what this revenue total is. Revenues from supporting organizations. Also, interestingly, grants from private foundations that are dispersed over the course of more than one calendar year get included in this non-donation revenue. So if a private foundation just gives an organization money for 1 year, that gets excluded, but if it's over a 3-5 year time period, that gets included. And then also contributions of property outside of any investment property like stock bonds that are being essentially utilized for the organization's exact purpose can also be included. So it's not a just straight, you take out all of your donations. There are some that you could consider donations that do get included in that revenue. Chris, I'll turn it back over to you.
So, and it's a long list of qualifications, so we're getting towards the end here. An eligible borrower will not have participated in certain other Federal Reserve facilities, and for those not familiar with it, when we refer to Federal Reserve facilities, we mean Federal Reserve lending programs. You will have not received specific support under the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Economic Stabilization Act of 2020, and they're looking at Subtitle A of Title IV of the CARES Act. You can have received funding under the Paycheck Protection Program, and that's important to highlight here. There are a number of CARES Act subsidies that you could have received without creating a problem, but you still have to indicate that getting this loan through the Federal Reserve is needed in spite of the funding opportunities in the CARES Act. And again, to what Colleen referred to earlier, the government is very leery of giving loans out to organizations that they believe ought to be financially stable. And they're afraid of some of the public backlash from that. And so it is a requirement that you demonstrate or that you certify that that you have a need for this loan. And then if not, you have to have contractually subordinated in terms of priority to any other loans or debt instruments. Anything you wanted to add there, Colleen?
Yeah, I think just kind of a consideration on, what we had talked about, some of the financial ratios on the prior slide, is that there isn't really any guidance yet on, at the time that you're applying for this loan, if your Paycheck Protection Program funding is still considered a loan because it hasn't been forgiven, does that then get considered in your, what your debt is for that, having to meet that 55% requirement? And then this last requirement, essentially what it means is you can't have other loans that in bankruptcy, you would have to pay before you would pay this loan. It needs to be considered, just as much of a priority as all of those others.
Sure. And this long list of eligibility criteria has been an issue in terms of it's made this program a little bit less popular as people dig into it, a little bit less attractive. But I think the more critical issue is not the eligibility requirements, but it's really the conditions on taking the loan that you're going to get into next, Colleen. That's really the meat and potatoes of what people are really focused on right now.
Definitely. So yeah, if you meet everything in that long list of eligible borrower requirements, then there are certain conditions and certifications that have to be met when getting this loan. So first, the borrower has to refrain from repaying the principal balance or interest on any other debt until the loan's repaid in full, unless the debt or interest payment is mandatory and due. So what I take this to mean is if you have other, debt and you have to make payments on it, you can still make payments on that. But let's say you have a line of credit and there isn't requirements to make the payments, then that potentially you may not be able to make payments. This also, you can't essentially take this loan and just repay off other loans that may not have as good of terms. Also, you can't seek to cancel or reduce any committed lines of credit. So again, you can't just pay off a line of credit. You can't, say, okay, we have a $1 million line of credit available. We want to reduce that to $500,000. It's going to have to stay at that $1 million while you have this loan. There needs to be a reasonable basis that there's a belief that essentially there's no going concern for the organization. It's going to be able to meet its financial obligations for the next 90 days, and it doesn't expect to file for bankruptcy. Also, it has to certify that it's eligible in light of conflicts of interest that are prohibited under Section 4019 of the CARES Act. And what that essentially is just making sure that members of Congress, the president, the vice president, and their family members, businesses that they own aren't unfairly getting to take advantage of this assistance. And then also, and these are kind of the two bigger conditions, the organization needs to make a commitment to make a reasonable effort to maintain pre-pandemic workforce and compensation levels. Now, this isn't as stringent as it is for the Paycheck Protection Program. Under the Paycheck Protection Program, there's a number of employees that you have to keep on compared to prior year. There's an amount of wages and services that have to be continued. With this one, it just says you have to make a reasonable effort. A reasonable effort isn't necessarily defined. The FAQs that are out does state that if an organization has laid off or furloughed employees due to the conditions caused by COVID-19, that they are still eligible to borrow, of course, if they meet all of the other eligible borrower requirements. Another big one, and this kind of has a big implication in the healthcare space, is there's wage restrictions for highly compensated employees. So a highly compensated employee is considered an employee that was compensated $425,000 or more in 2019. With that, during the length of the loan and for a year after the loan is paid off, that employee's compensation can't be more than the 2019 compensation. And then if the compensation of the employee is in excess of $3 million, it's then anything that's over that is reduced. So for example, in 2018, if an employee's compensation was $4 million during the loan and 1 year after, they're limited to $3.5 million because that extra million over the $3 million is reduced by 50%. There's also limitations on severance that it can't be more than twice the individual's 2018 wages. There also, in general, compensation can be calculated using the federal tax rules, so that would be W-2 Box 1. However, if there's a large deferred compensation, and that's considered to be at least the value at least 30% of the total compensation, then it's potential that you might have to follow the SEC rules. There is some vesting considerations in that. So just be aware if you have an employee that has a large deferred compensation plan, there may be some more digging that needs to go into that versus just looking at the W-2. Also, an organization can't terminate any collective bargaining agreements during the loan or for 2 years afterwards. And then it also has to remain neutral in any union negotiations.
Now, Colleen, one thing that I think is helpful to point out here is, unlike the tax reform law that was passed in 2017, the wage restrictions in this scenario, there's no exemption to that. It's anyone's wages. So in the tax reform law of 2017, there were some exemptions for clinical wages, for example, when they had special rules for highly compensated individuals. But here, it's no matter what the wages are for, they're subject to this restriction.
Correct. Yeah. So with the tax reform, there was an excise tax put on compensation in excess of $1 million for employees of tax-exempt organizations. There was, like you mentioned, though, an exception for those providing medical services, with the IRS realizing that a lot of healthcare organizations are tax-exempt and they have physicians that may be compensated, based on their production. And this is where this kind of gets can cause a problem for tax-exempt healthcare organizations, in that if it's based on production and they, end up having a better year than they had in 19, their compensation is going to be limited to that 2019 amount.
Because if I'm an organization and I have, let's just say, even with another, if I have physicians that are on, like you say, a production compensation program, and I accept this particular loan, well, now for the duration of the loan plus an additional year, I can't allow their compensation to go up in order to be compliant with this, but I may have an agreement that contradicts that with the physician. And so this is an area that would need to be renegotiated, and how you're going to handle that with your workforce. So want to highlight here for Moss Adams, our response to COVID-19. It's really impacted so many different areas of our life. And so we have a website, mossadams.com/COVID-19-implications, that's really focused on how to navigate some of the issues, focus on rebuilding our organizations and how to get through this difficult time. And not only how to rebuild, but then how to thrive. So everything from tax strategies to in accounting alerts, to also how to maximize revenues, how to take advantage of funding opportunities, whether it's through the CARES Act or other programs. There's quite a bit of information that's out there, and would encourage everybody to take a look. Go to move forward one more slide. Before we finish, and here's our contact information, Colleen, I thought it would be helpful if we just walked through how many organizations are viewing this. We get a lot of questions about, this lending program, which is often called the Main Street Lending Program, and yet there are very few clients of ours who are moving forward with it, and much of that has to do with the restrictions that we've laid out. If I'm a tax-exempt organization, or I'm representing a tax-exempt organization, I would want to make sure I understood what the program is, and that we had a discussion as an organization and decided whether it made sense for us. But some of the factors that are really making it difficult for organizations to move forward are the conditions that Colleen outlined just a few moments ago. And Colleen, do you have clients that are moving forward with this on your end?
No, currently I don't have any that are planning to do that. There was a lot of, when the Paycheck Protection Program came out, there was a lot of interest in that. I think a big part of that is the funding was available earlier, and there's the forgiveness aspect of it. The terms of these loans are a lot better than some potential other funding that you could go and get, but along with the conditions, and then also some of the requirements to be an eligible borrower, may make it a little difficult for organizations that could really utilize the funding. It can make it difficult for them to obtain it, or it can make it very difficult afterwards, especially for some of the healthcare organizations with those wage restrictions. So definitely interest on, the details of it, but so far I haven't heard anybody say that they're looking at moving forward with it when it becomes operational.
Thank you for that. On the slide here, you'll see both of our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us with questions that you have. We would love to hear from you. We also want to thank CPCA for hosting this and allowing us to present this information in this format today.
Yes, thank you guys very much.